A small act of kindness from a stranger changed a frightened boy's world and ended up transforming the lives of everyone around him. Emily wiped her hands on the edge of her apron as she carried a tray of plates back to the counter. The diner was half full that evening, filled with the soft hum of conversations and the clinking of forks against dishes. The smell of coffee hung in the air, mixed with the greasy comfort of fries and burgers sizzling on the grill. It was a shift like so many others she had worked before, long and tiring, but something about that night would stay with her forever. She was moving quickly between tables, when her eyes landed on a boy sitting alone in a booth near the window. At first, she thought maybe his parents were in the restroom or paying at the counter. But as the minutes passed, no one appeared. He sat quietly, his small hands resting stiffly on the table, shoulders hunched as though he was trying to make himself invisible. Emily slowed her steps and studied him more closely. He looked about 8 years old, with soft brown hair that fell over his forehead and big eyes that darted nervously around the room. His legs swung restlessly under the table. Not in the playful way kids often fidget, but in an unsettled rhythm, like he couldn't quite steady himself. And then she noticed his hands. They were trembling slightly as they clutched the edge of the table. The boy was shaking. Something in Emily's heart tightened. She had seen plenty of kids come through the diner, most of them laughing, whining, or demanding pancakes at odd hours. But this boy was different. He looked fragile, as though the weight of the world pressed on his small shoulders. He wasn't crying, but his silence was louder than any sob. Emily approached the booth carefully, not wanting to startle him. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said softly. Her voice warm but gentle, the way she sometimes spoke to her little cousin when he was upset. "Are you waiting for someone?" The boy lifted his eyes to her, wide and uncertain. He didn't answer. Instead, he blinked rapidly and lowered his gaze back to the table, his fingers tapping against the wood in an anxious rhythm. Emily noticed how tightly he was pressing his lips together, as if speaking was too hard or too frightening. For a moment she just stood there, unsure of what to do. She didn't want to pry, but something in her told her she couldn't just walk away either. Then she remembered something. Inside the pocket of her apron, she often kept little trinket small things she picked up at thrift stores or from old toy bins. Sometimes kids got restless waiting for their food, and handing them a tiny surprise was her way of lightening the mood. That day, she had a tiny red toy car, no bigger than her palm. She hadn't thought much of it when she tucked it into her apron that morning, but now it felt almost as if she had put it there for this very boy. She reached into her pocket and slowly pulled it out. The little car was chipped at the edges, the paint faded from years of play, but its wheels still turned. She crouched slightly so she was on the boy's level and placed it gently on the table in front of him. "You know," she said with a small smile, "this car's been waiting for someone special to play with it. I think it was meant for you." For a moment, the boy didn't move. His hands remained still, his eyes flicking between the toy and Emily's face, as if trying to decide whether it was safe. Then, almost cautiously, he reached out and touched the car with the tips of his fingers. He gave the wheel a little push, and it rolled a few inches across the table. A flicker of something a spark lit up in his eyes. Emily watched as he picked it up with both hands, studying it carefully. He ran his thumb along the side, turned it over and rolled it again, this time with a bit more energy. Slowly, the stiffness in his shoulders began to ease. His lips parted just slightly, and though it wasn't a full smile, it was the beginning of one. Relief washed over Emily. She hadn't known if it would work. But seeing the boy's face soften made her chest feel lighter. She leaned a little closer and whispered, "That's a fast one. Bet it can beat any car on the road." The boy glanced at her briefly, almost as if he wanted to respond but didn't know how. Then he pushed the car again, this time with a quiet determination, watching as it zoomed to the other side of the table and bounced against the salt shaker. His small shoulders shook, but now it looked less like fear and more like the faint tremor of excitement. Emily stayed for another minute, just watching him, not wanting to break the moment. She could see how much that little piece of plastic meant to him, how it gave his restless hands something to hold and his anxious heart something to focus on. She didn't know why he had been sitting alone, trembling in a diner booth. But she knew one thing: he wasn't invisible anymore. Someone had noticed him, cared enough to try. She gave him a small nod and said, "I'll check on you in a bit, okay? You keep that car safe." The boy clutched the toy gently, as though it were treasure, and for the first time since she had noticed him, his eyes seemed a little less haunted. Emily turned to head back to the counter, her own heart warmed by the quiet change she had just witnessed. She didn't know who the boy was or why he had seemed so lost, but something inside her whispered that this was only the beginning of a story she could never have imagined. The diner buzzed on as usual, customers laughing, waiters calling out orders, the cook shouting from the kitchen butt for Emily. The world had narrowed for those few moments to one trembling boy in one tiny red toy car, and somehow she sensed that their paths had crossed for a reason. The bell above the diner's door jingled, a small sound that usually meant nothing more than another customer had come in. But this time, the moment it rang, the boy sitting at the booth lifted his head quickly. His small hands tightened around the toy car, and his wide eyes darted toward the entrance. Emily, who was carrying a tray of drinks to another table, noticed the change in him and turned to look. A man had just stepped inside. He stood tall, his shoulders broad, dressed in a dark suit that seemed out of place in the casual little diner. The faint shine of his shoes, the neatness of his tie, and the quiet confidence in the way he carried himself drew every eye in the room for at least a second. He wasn't like the usual customers who came in wearing jeans and jackets after a long day. He looked like someone who belonged in a boardroom, not at a booth in a corner diner. The boy's face softened as he saw the man, and in an instant he slipped out of the booth, clutching the toy in one hand. He hurried across the floor and ran straight into the man's arms. "Dad," the boy said, his voice full of relief and emotion. The man bent slightly, wrapping his arms around his son with a gentleness that seemed to contrast with his powerful presence. For a brief moment, it was clear this man wasn't just some stranger. He was the boy's world. The customers who had been quietly eating began to murmur among themselves. Emily caught snippets of their whispers as she placed the tray down on another table. Some recognized him immediately. His face had appeared in newspapers, on television, and in magazines more times than most people could count. He was Daniel Hart, the billionaire businessman who owned hotels, airlines, and half a dozen other companies people could only dream of working for. Emily's heart skipped. She had seen his picture once on a magazine cover someone had left behind in the diner, but she never expected to see him standing right there in front of her. And yet, despite the polished image and the expensive suit, his focus was only on his son. He crouched slightly, brushing the boy's hair back from his forehead. His expression filled with a mix of concern and relief. Daniel glanced down and noticed the little red toy car clutched tightly in his son's hand. His brows lifted slightly. He touched the toy gently with his finger and asked, "Where did you get this, Oliver?" His voice was low and steady, but Emily could sense the curiosity behind it. Oliver hesitated. He glanced back toward the booth where he had been sitting. Slowly, his small hand pointed toward Emily, who was now standing a few steps away, unsure whether to walk forward or quietly disappear. Her cheeks warmed, and she quickly wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly aware of the grease stain near the pocket where the toy had been. Daniel followed his son's gaze and looked directly at her. His eyes were sharp, clear, and searching, but not unkind. "Did you give this to him?" he asked, his tone calm, but carrying the weight of someone used to getting answers. Emily's throat felt dry. For a second, she wondered if she had done something wrong. Maybe she shouldn't have given something to a stranger's child. She straightened her back and nodded quickly. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice a little shaky. He looked upset, and I thought it might help. The diner had grown quieter. People were pretending to eat, but their eyes kept flicking toward the corner where the billionaire, his son, and the nervous waitress stood. Emily felt their stares pressing in on her, but she kept her eyes on the man in front of her. Daniel didn't speak right away. He looked at his son again, who was still holding onto the toy as though it were the most precious thing he owned. Then he looked back at Emily, his gaze steady, as though he was trying to read her intentions. Emily's heart pounded. She wanted to explain herself further, to say that she hadn't meant to cross any lines. that she often carried little toys for children who seemed restless or lonely. But before she could say anything more, Daniel gave a slight nod. His expression softened, though it still held traces of seriousness. Oliver tugged at his father's sleeve and held up the toy car proudly. His lips curved into a small smile, the kind that Emily had seen begin to form earlier. It was faint, but it was real. Daniel noticed it immediately. His eyes lingered on that smile as though it was something rare and fragile, something he hadn't seen in a long time. Emily shifted on her feet, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. She didn't know whether to step away and give them privacy, or to wait in case they needed something. But Daniel's attention returned to her, and she realized he wasn't done with the conversation. "You noticed he was upset?" Daniel asked, his voice lower now, not demanding, but almost curious. "Yes," Emily said softly. "He looked like he needed something. I didn't know what else to do, so I just gave him the toy." Daniel studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. Around them, the diner noise began to rise again as people returned to their meals, though many still stole glances. To Emily, the moment stretched out like a string pulled tight. She could feel the weight of who this man was. The stories she had heard about billionaires like him, untouchable, distant, living in a world far from hers. And yet here he was, standing in the small-town diner. Looking at her not as a server but as someone who had just done something that mattered, Emily finally lowered her eyes, her cheeks hot, and murmured, "I hope that was okay." There was a pause. Then Daniel spoke, his voice calm, but carrying a depth she didn't expect. It was more than okay. Emily glanced up in surprise. And for a second, she saw something in his expression she hadn't expected: gratitude. It was brief, hidden behind the cool composure of a man used to being in control. But it was there. Oliver was still clutching the toy, rolling it back and forth on his father's arm, as if he couldn't bear to let it go. His earlier trembling seemed to have eased, replaced with quiet focus on the tiny car. Emily realized her simple gesture had done more than calm a restless boyette, had brought a little light into his evening as Daniel stood straighter, placing a protective hand on his son's shoulder. Emily knew the encounter was far from over. She had no idea what he would say next, but she could already sense that her life had just shifted in a way she couldn't yet understand. Daniel sat down with his son in the booth, the leather seat creaking slightly under his weight. The boy Oliver slid in next to him, still clutching the little red toy car as though it was something priceless. Emily stood nearby for a moment, unsure whether to walk away or stay. Part of her told her she should get back to work, but another part of her wanted to make sure the boy remained calm. Daniel noticed her hesitation. He gave a slight nod, almost inviting her to remain for a while. And Emily took that as a sign to linger quietly at the side of the table. She watched as the powerful billionaire placed a gentle hand on his son's back, his expression soft but lined with worry. "You like that car?" Daniel asked his son softly. Oliver nodded, his fingers spinning one of the wheels. He didn't speak, but his body leaned closer toward his father as though he felt safer now. Daniel looked at Emily again, his eyes holding a weight that made her feel as though he could see right through her. Then, to her surprise, he began to speak, not in the cold, business-like way she imagined billionaires usually did, but in a low voice filled with quiet honesty. "My son has been through a lot," he said. "Since his mother passed away, he struggles." Emily's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to share something so personal, especially with someone he didn't know, but his tone carried no arrogance. Only the pain of a father who had watched his child suffer. "He has trouble with crowds," Daniel continued. "Even small noises sometimes overwhelm him. Some days, it feels like the world is too much for him. He shakes, he hides, he refuses to talk to anyone. Therapists have tried, teachers have tried, but—" He glanced at Oliver, whose small hands were now rolling the car back and forth on the table, calm and focused. "Nothing seems to bring him comfort the way this has." Emily looked at the boy and felt a lump rise in her throat. The tiny toy she had given without a second thought was doing something that trained professionals hadn't been able to achieve. Oliver wasn't trembling anymore. He wasn't staring off into space or withdrawing. He was present, absorbed, almost content. She swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. I'm sorry, she murmured. I didn't know. I just thought he needed something to hold on to. Daniel's gaze softened. You didn't know, and yet you helped him. Emily felt her cheeks flush, partly from the attention and partly from the sincerity in his voice. She shifted on her feet, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her apron. She wasn't used to being acknowledged for something so small. Oliver suddenly made a quiet sound, half a giggle, half a hummaz. He pushed the car across the table so it bumped against the sugar dispenser. His lips curved into a small smile, and though it wasn't broad, it was real. Daniel froze for a moment, his eyes fixed on his son's face, as if he had just seen the rarest thing in the world. Emily noticed it too. That smile was like sunlight breaking through clouds. She hadn't realized until now how much the boy's earlier trembling had weighed on the room. And now, with a single smile, it felt like the heaviness had lifted. Daniel reached out and brushed his son's hair back, his own lips pressing into a thin line as though he was holding back emotion. It's been weeks, he said softly, almost to himself. Weeks since I've seen him smile like that. The word struck Emily deeply. She glanced at Oliver again, her heart aching at the thought of what this child had endured. To lose his mother at such a young age, to live every day with fear and anxiety, was more than any child should have to bear. Oliver looked up at her suddenly, his eyes shy but curious. He held the car up a little as though showing her. Emily gave him a gentle smile and whispered, "That's yours now. You can keep it." For a second, Oliver seemed surprised, almost as if he couldn't believe someone would give him a gift with no expectation in return. Then he hugged the car to his chest, his small fingers tightening around it. And his smile grew just a little wider. Daniel let out a quiet breath, one that sounded almost like relief. His eyes returned to Emily, and she saw something in them she hadn't expected, gratitude mixed with something heavier. Something almost like vulnerability. You don't realize what you've done, he said. I've spent months trying to find ways to bring him peace. I can buy him anything, take him anywhere, but nothing has worked. And yet you, he paused, shaking his head slightly as though the words didn't come easily. You managed to reach him with something so simple. Emily didn't know how to respond. She felt both humbled and overwhelmed. She wasn't anyone special, just a waitress trying to make ends meet, working late shifts to pay for her classes. She hadn't set out to change anyone's life. And yet here she was, standing in front of a billionaire and his son, having done something no amount of wealth had been able to achieve. For a few moments, none of them spoke. The diner buzzed with life around them, but at their booth, the world felt smaller, quieter, more intimate. Daniel watched his son. Emily watched them both. Oliver rolled the toy car back and forth, completely absorbed in his tiny world of movement and sound. Emily thought about her own childhood for a moment. She remembered being scared sometimes, how her grandmother would hand her an old doll or tell her a story to calm her. It wasn't the object itself that mattered, it was the feeling of being seen, of knowing someone cared. Maybe that's what Oliver had needed all along. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice low and thoughtful. It's strange, isn't it? How the smallest gestures can mean more than all the big things. Emily nodded slowly. Sometimes it doesn't take much, just kindness. Daniel's eyes lingered on her for a long moment, as though he was trying to memorize her words. Then he turned his attention back to his son, his hand resting protectively on Oliver's shoulder. Emily stepped back slightly, giving them space, but her heart was racing. She felt as though something important had happened, something bigger than just handing a child a toy. She didn't understand it fully yet, but she could sense it. And as she watched Oliver smile faintly again, rolling the car along the edge of the table, she realized that this night had shifted the course of not just his life, but hers as well. Daniel sat quietly for a while, his arm resting protectively around Oliver as the boy continued to play with the little red toy car. The world outside the diner seemed far away. For Daniel, who was used to the rush of business meetings, his private jets and endless phone calls, this quiet moment with his son felt rare. And what struck him most was that the peace in Oliver's face hadn't come from anything he had provided. But from the kindness of a stranger, a waitress he had met only minutes ago, Emily stood nearby, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She didn't know if she should excuse herself or wait for him to order something. Normally, she would have stepped away, but something in Daniel's gaze told her he wanted her to stay. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost hesitant, as though he wasn't used to sharing his thoughts so openly. "You know," he said quietly, looking down at the toy in his son's hands, "most people see me and think money can solve anything. They believe I can buy happiness, buy comfort, buy peace. But this," he gestured toward Oliver, who was smiling faintly as he pushed the car across the table, "this is something I couldn't buy. And yet you gave it to him." Emily felt her cheeks warm. She wanted to tell him it was nothing, that it was just an old toy she happened to have in her apron pocket. But she could tell, from the emotion in his voice, that it wasn't nothing. To him, it was everything. "I just wanted to help," she said softly. He looked like he needed it. Daniel looked at her again, his eyes steady, almost searching. "And you did. More than you realize." Oliver tugged at his father's sleeve, showing him how fast the car could roll when he pushed it with all his strength. Daniel smiled faintly, but his attention soon returned to Emily. He studied her for a long moment, noticing the tiredness in her eyes, the faint dark circles that spoke of long shifts. Her apron was worn, with a faded stain she hadn't been able to wash out. He saw the way she stood strong, but with the quiet heaviness of someone carrying more than her share of burdens. "You work here full-time?" he asked suddenly. Emily nodded. "Yes. Nights, mostly. In mornings sometimes, in school." He pressed gently. She hesitated before answering, unsure why she was telling him the truth at all. "I'm studying nursing," she admitted. "But it's hard. Tuition's expensive and I've been falling behind. Sometimes I think maybe I should stop for a while, just work more shifts." Daniel's brows drew together, his expression sharpening slightly. "Stop," Emily shrugged, her hands twisting in her apron. "It's not forever. Just until I save more money. I don't want to give up, but life doesn't always give choices." Daniel leaned back, his gaze still locked on her. For a man who was used to negotiating billion-dollar deals, this moment felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed. Here was a young woman, working herself to exhaustion. Not for luxury or ambition, but simply to chase a dream that would help others. And she had, without hesitation, given his son something no one else could give: comfort. He thought about all the people he met daily: business partners, investors, colleagues, so many of them chasing wealth, status, or recognition. Yet here was a waitress who had shown more heart in a single act than most of them did in a lifetime. "You shouldn't have to stop," Daniel said firmly, his voice carrying a quiet strength. Emily looked at him, startled. "What do you mean?" He rested a hand on the table, his fingers tapping lightly, as though he was making a decision. "I mean, you shouldn't have to give up your education because of money. You've proven tonight that your kindness, your instincts, your compassion, they matter. People like you should be nurses. People like you should be out there helping others." Emily blinked, unsure how to respond. "I appreciate that, but no," he interrupted gently, but with conviction. "You helped my son when no one else could. Do you understand how much that means to me? Do you understand how much that means to him?" He nodded toward Oliver, who was still playing happily with the toy car, his anxiety forgotten for the moment. "I can never repay that fully. But I can at least make sure you don't have to choose between your dream and survival." Her breath caught. "Don't understand." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering, but his words carrying the weight of a promise. "I want to cover your tuition. Every expense. From now until you finish. You shouldn't have to worry about money while you're doing something this important. And after tonight, I know you'll be the kind of nurse the world needs." Emily froze. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. A billionaire offering to pay her way through school? It sounded impossible, like something out of a movie or a dream. Her heart raced, and she shook her head quickly. "I can't accept that. It's too much." Daniel's lips curved into the faintest smile, but his eyes remained serious. "It's not too much. For me, it's nothing. For you, it's everything. And for my son, he looked at Oliver again, his voice softening. For my son, it's the least I can do for the person who gave him back his smile. Emily's throat tightened, her eyes stinging with sudden tears she hadn't expected. She wasn't the type to cry easily, especially not in front of strangers. But the sincerity in his voice broke through every wall she had built. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say yes, Daniel replied simply. That's all I need. The diner around them carried on, dishes clattered. Conversations buzzed. The cook shouted out another order, but at that booth everything felt still. Emily stared at him, trying to decide if she could really believe what she was hearing. She thought about all the nights she had sat at her tiny kitchen table, staring at bills and textbooks, wondering if she would ever make it through. She thought about the exhaustion in her bones after endless shifts, the doubt that crept in when she fell behind in class. And now, in one unexpected night, all of that could change. Oliver looked up at her, holding the toy car out as though offering it for her to see again. His small smile was still there, and it struck her that this boy, this fragile, grieving child, was the reason everything was happening. She smiled back at him through her tears, then looked at Daniel. I don't know why you do this for me, she said softly. Because you deserve it? Daniel answered. Because you reminded me tonight that money means nothing without humanity. And because my son smiled because of you. That's all the reason I need. Emily finally nodded, her voice breaking as she whispered, Thank you. Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression easing, though the intensity in his eyes remained. No, he said quietly. Thank you. Weeks passed after that night at the diner, but Emily could hardly forget what had happened. Life had started to feel different, brighter, as though a hidden weight had been lifted. She continued her shifts, but now, instead of feeling exhausted and worn out at the end of the day, she carried a quiet excitement in her heart. Every time she glanced at the little red toy car she had given Oliver, she remembered the way his face had lit up, the way his small body had relaxed in her presence. That night had reminded her of the power of small gestures, and it stayed with her like a gentle warmth. True to his word, Daniel Hart had followed up on his promise. Within a few days, Emily received a carefully written letter, accompanied by a check covering her tuition fees and other school expenses. She stared at it for a long time, unable to believe it. It wasn't just the money, it was the recognition. The validation that someone had seen her effort, her struggle, and her heart. She felt a mixture of awe, disbelief, and gratitude. For someone like her, who had worked tirelessly just to scrape by, this act of kindness was life-changing. Her first day back in class, Emily couldn't help but think of Oliver. She pictured him running his fingers over the small car, smiling for the first time in weeks. She realized that what she had done for him, something so simple, had rippled outward. That one gesture, that one moment of noticing and caring, had changed not only a child's night, but the course of her own life. She smiled to herself, feeling lighter than she had in months. Emily also stayed in touch with Oliver. Daniel had given her his contact information, and occasionally she received updates on the boy. Every message or photo warmed her heart. One picture showed Oliver sitting in the garden with the toy car next to him, the sunlight glinting off the tiny red surface, his eyes sparkling with delight. Another showed him laughing at a small party with friends, something Emily never thought she would see so soon. With every update, she felt proud, not because of anything she had done for herself, but because she had helped a child heal, even in the smallest way, for Daniel. The experience had been transformative as well. As a billionaire, he had always believed that wealth meant control, security, and influence. He had worked tirelessly, thinking that providing his son with the finest toys, the best schools, and the safest environments would be enough. Yet he had learned that money alone could not solve all problems. Emily's kindness had reminded him that real care, the kind that comes from noticing another person's needs and responding with compassion, was priceless. He often thought back to that night, watching Emily give Oliver the toy car, and he realized he had underestimated the power of small acts. That moment of generosity had not only comforted his son, but it also inspired him to reconsider the way he approached life. He began to value empathy more, noticing little things he had once overlooked. A simple conversation with a colleague, a kind word to a stranger, a smile offered to someone who seemed lost. These things took on new importance. Emily, meanwhile, dove into her studies with renewed energy and purpose. She no longer saw school as a distant, unattainable dream, but as something within her reach. She poured herself into every assignment, every practice session, motivated by the knowledge that someone had believed in her when it mattered most. She thought of Daniel's words often, that her kindness, her instinct to help, was what made her special, and that she could take that same compassion into her career as a nurse. Her relationship with Oliver grew steadily, though carefully. Daniel made sure to balance the child's need for comfort with normal routines, and Emily became a gentle presence in his life. She didn't intrude, but when she visited, she found Oliver calmer, more confident, and increasingly willing to open up. He laughed more easily now, asked questions, and even shared little stories about his day. Emily felt a deep sense of fulfillment watching him progress, knowing that the simple act of handing him a small toy had sparked a chain of healing. The bond between Emily and Daniel also grew. While she had initially felt intimidated by his status, wealth, and reputation, she discovered that beneath the polished exterior, he was a father deeply concerned about his son's well-being. Their interactions were always respectful, yet warm. Daniel valued her insight, her perspective on Oliver's needs, and often consulted her when decisions about his son's comfort arose. For Emily, this was unlike anything she had expected. She had entered the diner as a waitress, just trying to make ends meet. And now she found herself in a circle of trust with a man who had the world at his feet. Life had a way of surprising her in unexpected ways. One afternoon, Emily received a letter from Daniel, thanking her again not for the gesture alone, but for reminding him of something essential. "You have changed more than just my son's evening," he wrote. "You have reminded me that life is not only about wealth or power, but about noticing those who need a hand, a smile, or a little hope. That is a lesson I will carry forever." Emily read it several times, feeling a swell of emotion. She kept the letter tucked in her notebook, a reminder of the night that changed everything. For Oliver, the world began to open up gradually. He no longer feared small noises or unexpected interactions. He began to engage with other children, sometimes tentatively, sometimes with joy that surprised even his father. Emily sometimes observed these changes during her visits, feeling a sense of quiet pride. She never took the credit for his progress. It was a combination of care, therapy, family love, and, yes, her small act of noticing him in a diner, but she could see the difference. The boy she had met trembling in a corner booth was slowly becoming a confident, happy child. The story of that night, though it remained private, also changed Emily personally. She learned that even small gestures could have tremendous impact. Giving her time, attention, or a tiny toy had changed a life, and in return had changed hers. She realized she could never underestimate the power of caring, of noticing, of acting when someone needed help. That lesson extended beyond the diner, beyond Oliver and Daniel, into every encounter she had in her own life. In the months that followed, Emily completed her nursing degree, supported fully by Daniel's generosity. She graduated with honors, but more importantly, she graduated with confidence, knowing that the world had room for people like her, people who cared, who acted, and who believed in small acts of kindness. Her first job as a nurse brought her into contact with children like Oliver, children who were scared, anxious, or struggling. She remembered the trembling boy in the diner every time she calmed a patient or offered comfort, knowing that sometimes it was the simplest gestures that mattered most. Daniel watched his son's progress with quiet pride and reflection. He continued to manage his vast business empire, but his priorities had shifted. He spent more time with Oliver, paying attention to the small moments of the bedtime stories, the shared laughter, the way his son's eyes lit up when he learned something new. And he never forgot the waitress who had reminded him. In one evening, that humanity, compassion, and kindness were worth more than all the wealth in the world. For Emily, Daniel, and Oliver, that single night at the diner became a turning point. It was a story without fanfare, without headlines, but it was a story of real-life transformation. A small toy, given without thought, had sparked healing. A father, humbled by his child's smile, had offered a future-changing opportunity. And a young woman, simply acting with kindness, discovered her own strength and purpose. Life moved forward, as it always does. Emily went on to help countless patients, carrying with her the lessons of empathy and human connection. Oliver grew into a confident, happy boy, shaped not just by wealth or privilege, but by the experience of being seen, valued, and cared for. Daniel, forever changed, never underestimated the power of small gestures again, understanding that true wealth is measured not in dollars, but in love, compassion, and the moments that make life meaningful. And sometimes, when Emily walked past that diner, she would glance inside and smile, remembering the boy she had handed a tiny red toy car to and how, in that simple act, 3 lives had been forever changed.